In Australia, just at the moment, we have an interesting controversy taking place over, well, yes, which one? Yeah, we've got a federal election on Saturday. That's sort of 28,000 individual little controversies. One of which is around rugby player Israel Folau. And I don't know if you heard this. Israel Folau is a devout believer. I think there's some question as to exactly whether his Trinitarian theology would pass, Nicene muster. But and I don't know, and I'm not interested in that particularly at this point. He posted on Instagram, I think, or Twitter, a post 12 months ago, got into some trouble for it, and then in April this year posted again on Instagram, effectively merely a quote from 1 Corinthians 6. No, that's right. So not a direct quote. Almost totally true and almost totally counterproductive. And it's just a really interesting phenomenon that you can speak almost totally truthfully and be almost totally counterproductive. And what I want to do as we explore what it takes to reach a city, and Gunnar, I just was so appreciative of Gunnar's words as at centering us and grounding us and reminding us and kneading into us the reality that the first place, the last place, the A to Z, that's how we say it, isn't it? Z? Yeah, sorry, I just thought I'd get that out there. The A to Z is the gospel, Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, ascended, Lord. The gospel is the ground of our life and being. And it's a gospel that sends us out in a mission. And so what we're going to do this morning, for the rest of the morning and then after lunch, is to talk about mission and how to move forward in mission and reach our context, our cities, and with this sort of terrifying spectre in the background that it's possible for you to be totally, faithfully, truthfully proclaiming the gospel, and for what you do to be almost completely counterproductive. So let's not do that, hey? Let's see if we can not do that. Interestingly, there's a lot of things at the moment, particularly a lot of books and material about movement and cities. By cities, it's interesting. Just a word about cities to start with. In the United States is really a country of small towns. You might not realise this because what you hear about and see about and what's in the movies is the 4 or 5 big cities that there are in the US, New York and LA and Chicago and 1 or 2 others. But most of America is made out of small towns. And small town America for many, many years has been the home of Christianity and what you might call Christian values. Family values, Christian values, wholesomeness, the Midwest, all of that kind of stuff. And the context of the US is that people went from their small town to the big cities to lose their virginity and to lose their faith and to lose everything. And so that's why in kind of US, American culture, folklore, the way that the city is depicted, what's the most famous city in US pop culture? Gotham City. Gotham City. And what's Gotham City like? It's a place of darkness and wickedness where vice and crime proliferate and what's needed in Gotham City is a hero. In this case, a tortured hero, a kind of hero who has himself suffered and experiences this a dual nature. a saviour of two natures, etc., etc., etc. And so that's the folklore of the US, where cities were places you went to lose faith. Country towns, towns, small town America, was where faith flourished. And so one of the reasons that city to city has a city focus is because it derives out of the US context, where for many pastors in towns, the word would be, don't go to a city because you can't be a Christian in a city. Don't go to a city because it doesn't work in a city and they're bad places. Or if you have to go to a city, then come back. And so Keller gets to New York and he says, actually, you can be a Christian in a city and you can flourish as a Christian in a city. And in fact, and this is the kind of the kicker, for the first time, I think in about 2008, more people in the world lived in cities than not in cities. First time in the history of humankind, more people lived in cities, and that is accelerating at a massive rate. Massive progress towards movement towards cities, massive depletion of rural and remote areas. There's all sorts of reasons for that. The increasing technology with agriculture, et cetera, means that there are all sorts of reasons why people are moving in the hundreds of thousands every day across the world into cities. And so I was just with some church planters in some of the cities in India of 25 million people in a city. 25, that's the entire population of Australia. It's 5 times the population of New Zealand or something, isn't it? In one city. What does that mean? How do you conceive of that one place with that many people, the density and the crowding? It's just quite astonishing. The reason for saying that is to say that in a city-city context, when we talk about how to reach a city, we're not particularly meaning how to reach something that's really large and incredibly dense. It's just how to reach a population centre. Okay, so Palmy's a city in that sense. Does Palmy get called a city technically?
We tried.
Yeah, okay. And I think fair enough. Palmy counts is all I'm saying. There are an increasing number of books on these things, city movements, and one just to give you just one if you want to follow up, and I'll give you a number of books over the course of the time that we have together that you might want to follow up. This guy, Tom White, is a really interesting author. This is a really badly written book. It needed at least 3 edits before being released, but it might even be self-published. I don't know what happened. So what you've got to do is, and I've got a couple of comments to make about books that I'll recommend like that. You've got to work hard to read this book and to get there's a lot of kind of dirt around it, but there's massive amounts of gold in it. He's leading a prayer movement in one of the major cities of India, which is just one of the most remarkable things I've heard about, where there is astonishing bringing together of Christians in various pockets all across the city in their thousands, and people being brought to Christ and renewed in the gospel in their thousands. And he's talking about this building city gospel movements, the practitioner's guide. So there's an increasing interest in this stuff, and Tom White's got a book on that like that. Keller has likewise in his book Centre Church a diagram at the end of the book, which we'll come back to tomorrow afternoon, as his kind of way of trying to express what it takes to reach a city. You'll see that at the heart of what he has here, in that red dot in the middle, is what he calls a contextualized theological vision. So a contextualized theological vision is this. The Centre Church, the book, has this, I think one of the most important contributions that it makes is to say that there is something between theology and practice. So when I was first a Christian and then first involved in ministry things, I got told there are 2 things in life. There's theology and there's practice. What you've got to do is get your theology right, and then you put it into practice. Okay, and that sounds pretty simple. It sounds fairly intuitive. Get your theology right, understand what is it the scriptures teach, interpret it properly, take into account kind of the development of doctrine and Christian thought over the course of the 2,000 years and all that kind of stuff, so that you get your head right, and then you put it into practice. You go and do it. If the Bible says have bishops, which it does in Titus 1:3-5, more or less, then go have bishops. Or if it says have presbyteries, then you see what I'm saying? Just if there's what the Bible says, there's what you do. Doctrine, practice. Keller says that's not how things are at all. And that the fact that we don't recognize that there's a thing between doctrine and practice is actually a massive problem. He calls the thing in between theological vision. And it's a really tricky thing to lay your hands on and get a grip on. It's like that, you know that dot in your eye? Every now and again you see the dot in your eye. But when you move your eye to try and focus on the dot, it keeps moving. So every time you try and look at it, it keeps moving, and you end up, and someone might catch you sort of turning around in circles. Have you ever, you know what I'm talking about, that little dot in your eye? If you look at it, it moves. And a theological vision's a bit like that. It's like the glasses we have on, which we look through. It's very difficult to look at, because if you take your glasses off, what can you see? Not much. Theological vision is all the assumptions we bring to the translation of theology into practice. All the assumptions about knowledge, what counts for knowledge, what makes a good argument, all the assumptions we have about our culture and context and what works and what doesn't work, all the assumptions about how power is used and deployed properly or improperly, what counts as an abuse of power and not an abuse of power, all the assumptions that we bring about communication. And Keller says that thing, that theological vision, which is, he would say, the articulation of the gospel. So it's an articulation of the gospel for a time and a place with all of that culture and context background around it. One of the most useful things that you can do is to read about articulations of the gospel in completely different cultures. Okay, so there was a 11th century bishop called Anselm of Canterbury who wrote a book called Cur Deus Homo, Why Did God Become Man? It's a statement of the gospel that makes no sense to us now. It's astonishing. I mean, it's just really freaky, weird kind of stuff. It makes brilliant sense. It's a brilliant articulation of the gospel in a feudal context where you had knights kind of riding around, upholding honor and valor, and where the greatest thing you can do to someone is to insult them. And when someone's majesty is insulted, then either you have to get punished by them, and really interestingly, Anselm says God did not go down the punishment route. His view is not penal. He says instead, how do you fix up someone's broken honor? The answer is you offer them a gift. And so Jesus Christ offers God a gift. And now you look at that and you think, I don't even know what honor is. We don't talk about honor, offended majesty. What are you talking about? No sense in our context. A brilliant articulation of the gospel in his context, because he was operating with a really functionally powerful theological vision. I'll give you another one, a lovely story about reaching out to prostitutes in Korea. Korean culture is a very, very interesting and different culture. Massive recognition of and submission to hierarchy and authority. And so there's a great American missionary called Harvey Conn who realized that in order, the key doctrine to deploy in order to reach out to prostitutes in Korea was the doctrine of predestination. So you try that in your evangelism, right? To try and evangelize people on the basis of the doctrine of predestination. And the reason that worked was that he was very fruitful in persuading Korean prostitutes that if God had chosen them, it didn't matter whether they felt worthy or not. They just were chosen. And because they're used to submitting to authority, they went, okay, and became Christians by hundreds. So you see, if you think that it's just a case of, here's the gospel, now just go say it and see what happens, teach it and see people grow, then what you've misunderstood is the way in which that translation process has been assumed by you instead of being thoughtfully processed by you. And it's theological vision which lies at the heart of a movement of the gospel in a city. It just is the case that that Tim Keller turns out under God to have been pretty close to the perfect person to minister in New York. I think he would have done a pretty terrible job in Palmy. Like he would have. He would have no idea he would have done a terrible job in Sydney. He just happened to be the right guy for the right time in the right place in New York, and he's managed to find a way to speak New Yorkish, take the gospel, articulate it, contextualize it, and through a theological vision which takes into account the time and the place. And he happens to be a person of, I think, exceptional genius in being able to understand what is a context. His contextual or cultural analysis is not superficial, but really gets down deep, and we're going to benefit from some of that over the next day or so. And he has been able to speak in New York, so that really it's the case that thousands of New Yorkers have been converted to Christ. When he got there, there was no church shopping. There just weren't enough Christians to church shop, right? And there weren't Christians swapping and growing churches by transfer growth because there just were no people to transfer. And so the church-going population of New York has grown from, in 89, 1 to 19, 5%. So it's grown 5 times. And so this is New York. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not all Keller, it's not all Redeemer, but what Redeemer did was kick enough dust in the air that meant that things really moved ahead. And so that New York went from 1% of church-going population to 5% church-going population. And right now there's a vision to take that from 5% to 15%. And the theory is that once you get to about 10 or 15%, that represents a tipping point where it's sort of like this, the snowball has gotten down onto the mountain and it just starts rolling on and on. A movement of the gospel is that kind of moment when gospel growth, the number of people coming to Christ in a place, because they get how the gospel links with their actual lived experience. Movement of the gospel is where the growth of the number of Christians exceeds at a substantive rate the growth of the population in that place. Because if you have a growth of the gospel exceeding the growth of population over time, and we're in here for the long haul, then that just leads to major gospel growth, like what happened, for example, in Korea. So South Korea, the population of Christians at the beginning of the century, the 20th century, tiny, 2%. Mid-century, 50% of the country goes to church on Sunday. It's arguable as to whether it's worth opening your small business because there's just no one around because they're all in church. Imagine that. These things are possible, and they're not far. They're just a plane ride away. So Keller says that the heart of a movement of the gospel is a contextualized theological vision. If we don't do the hard work of doing contextualized theological vision, a theological vision that reflects and understands and intersects with the context that we're in, then you may end up being incredibly biblically faithful and true and incredibly unfruitful and counterproductive, which would be just a crying shame. The sort of second ring around is what he calls church planting and church renewal movements, which is networks, denominations, connections, conglomerates, churches, big churches, little churches, both planting new churches as well as revitalizing existing churches. And that the heart of the effect of this contextualized theological vision is churches, which has always been at the center of God's purpose for his work in the world, renewing in the gospel and for their context. And then around that is a series of specialized ministries. You see prayer and evangelistic ministries, justice and mercy ministries, faith and work initiatives, support for family life in the city, particularly. You can see the American sort of issue rising there. Can you raise kids in a place like New York City? No. Yes, you can. You're not consigning them to being, just kind of like John McEnroe or something like that. He was a tennis player that some of you may remember. Theological training, unity of Christian leaders, and so on. So that's Keller's view of a contextualized, of what it takes to reach a city. What we're doing in this session is focusing on the context issues, and I want to put before you the inevitability and necessity of contextualization. Contextualization in some places is a dirty word, in some places is a silver bullet, and the truth is it's neither of those two things. It's not a silver bullet, nor is it a dirty word. Let me just give you a little bit of material on the biblical mandate for contextualization, uh, particularly from Paul in 1 Corinthians 9. You see the apostle write, "For though I am free with respect to all, I've made myself a slave to all so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew." Notice, as a Jew. It didn't quite say to the Jews I became a Jew. He became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. Of course, by the way, what is Paul? He's a Jew. Except he doesn't quite, his self-identification is no longer quite tied to those categories, you see. So he's happy to live under the law. I don't know if you know what it's like to live under the law, under the Torah, the Old Testament law. Real pain in the neck. Really a lot of stuff that you've got to just take care of and not do and make sure about, and you can't wear clothes of two sorts, and bacon and eggs is just, really out, and all sorts of stuff. Really difficult. Really difficult. Sabbath and so on. Though I myself am not under the law. Very remarkable thing for a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee, to just be so cleanly in Christ that he can just say as boldly as that, "I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law." Oh, who knows what that means, and we're not going to go into that. So interesting. "So that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. And I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I might share in its blessings." Paul's missional flexibility was astonishing. That this is what you call contextualization. He became as one of those to whom he was reaching out. Notice he's quite comfortable to speak in terms not only of means but ends. He doesn't become as one under the law in order to be faithful in witness to those under the law. I mean, he does that. True, but he becomes as one under the law in order to win those under the law. He's quite bold about talking about not just the means of ministry, but the ends of ministry as well. And he's just fully confident that that doesn't compromise the sovereignty of God. He's not sort of taking God's place in any of that sort of thing. He's just happy to talk about ends. This particular, I think, becomes in terms of conduct. So you see this in the Acts of the Apostles. Paul goes to Jerusalem and he offers the sacrifices in Jerusalem, and he does all this sort of stuff. He goes to the temple, and he doesn't bring his Gentile friend into the temple, etc., etc. So this is primarily, I think, conduct. This is, to the hipster, I become a hipster, and I drink only, cold press, pour over, latte, soy. I'm so not a hipster. If that wasn't totally obvious by now. And, but in the area where I'm at, am I up for just learning a little bit about their concerns and interests and talking the language a little bit, and not pretending to be something that I'm not? I mean, there's a kind of there's a be who you are, you do you sort of issue at stake here as well, right? There's no point me pretending to be a 15-year-old kid. Who wants to be a 15-year-old kid again, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't relate or connect or identify or remember or enter into their experience or listen. Okay, so this is conduct, but 1 Corinthians 14, I think, takes it even further to not just conduct, but content. Paul's the biggest speaker in tongues, perhaps in the history of the world. So there you go. That's kind of a pretty interesting phenomenon. And the least speaker in tongues in church services. That's how flexible he is. We just need perhaps all a little bit more chill like him. And he's writing in 1 Corinthians 14 to say, make a point. And the point is, when you're gathered together, you're supposed to be there for each other, not for yourself. And therefore, you have to do what you do when you're together in a way that, his key word here is oikodomio, which is to build up, to be edifying. Or he says, so with yourselves, if in a tongue you utter speech that's not intelligible, how will anyone know what's being said? He's just given the example of the trumpet, which makes an indistinct sound, and the flute, which doesn't play properly, and all that sort of thing. And he says, if you utter speech that's not intelligible, how will anyone know what's being said? For you'll be speaking to the air. There are doubtless many different kinds of sounds in the world. Nothing is without sound. If then I do not know the meaning of a sound, I'll be a foreigner. The word is there for foreigner is barbarian. And that's what barbarians sound like, isn't it? They sort of talk gibberish, and it's an onomatopoeic word, where the word sounds like the thing it's describing. If I don't know the meaning of a sound, I'm just a babbler. I'm a barbarian to the speaker, and the speaker a barbarian to me. So with yourselves, and since you're eager for spiritual gifts, try to excel in them for building up the church. So notice what Paul does here. He links building up the church to intelligibility. The key category here, the key word here is intelligibility. Now, what's really interesting, we're going to come to this, is that he later links this. This is obviously to believers at this point, in verses 9 to 12. Later in the chapter, verse 24 and forward, he's going to talk about it in relation to non-believers. Paul expects both non-believers and believers to be present in the gathering of the body of Christ. And here's the point, for what's done there to be intelligible. To be intelligible. Now, I want to suggest to you that intelligibility begins with language. Speaking in tongues is not intelligible unless there's an interpreter or an interpretation, which is why Paul says don't have speaking in tongues in church unless there's interpretation. But it's not just linguistic intelligibility, it's also cultural intelligibility. Tweeting a version of 1 Corinthians 6 is culturally incomprehensible. And again, notice that the apostle is quite at home, quite comfortable with taking responsibility for ends, not just means. He's quite comfortable with taking responsibility for being intelligible, for ensuring that you sufficiently understand how it is that people comprehend things, that you'll adjust what you say to make sure that it's comprehensible by them. And so what you've got in 1 Corinthians especially, both 9 and 14, is the kind of biblical mandate for contextualization, which I'll give you a definition of contextualization in a moment. A biblical mandate for contextualization, which is that the sort of the essence, a contextualized theological vision of the gospel, in both conduct and in content, in terms of intelligibility. Which leads to, once as you see this and you get your head into this, can you think of some examples? So this is, I think, the mandate. This says, do it. What are some examples of, in the Bible, where we see contextualization happening right in front of our very eyes, even if the biblical author is not particularly trumpeting it or pointing it out, but you can see it. So let's just get our contextualization antennae going. What are some biblical examples of contextualization? And this is a non-rhetorical question. Acts 17. Great. So Acts 17 is Paul where? In Athens, in the Areopagus. He gets straight into their grid. There's all sorts of things that he does not say, and all sorts of things that he does say that are different from the speeches that he has previously, say in Acts 13. And so you know that there are 3 speeches by Paul, 3 evangelistic speeches by Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. Do you know who they're to? Late. I mean, that's towards the end. In the missions, there's one to Jews, there's one to God-fearers, and there's one to pagans. And you know what? They're different. They're different. Yeah, I think that's that's a classic study to do in first-year seminaries, to go, hold on, isn't he supposed to be proclaiming the gospel? And the answer is yes. What's really interesting is that the Bible doesn't give you the gospel. It gives you the one gospel expressed in many, many, many ways. Yeah. Jesus with the Samaritan woman talking about at the well. So she's got some pretty interesting issues going on in her life. Jesus has this advantage, which is that he can read other people's minds. That does, but nonetheless, it does help with contextualisation. You get right inside there. We've got to study. Yep, good. What are some other examples? The parables. Yeah, really interesting. One of the things to wrestle with the parables is that Jesus says the purpose of parables is to make things hidden and unclear in Mark 4. I'm not, I mean, I know that that's a quote from Isaiah 6. I'm just not quite sure what to do with with that. I think the idea is that the same thing when Jesus talks about for the to the one who has more will be given, and to the one who doesn't have what they have will be taken away. The idea is what the parable does is it sort of forces you in, it puts a wedge in between people from those who either see that there's something there and come forward, or think that it's just a bunch of nonsense and turn away. And so the parables have this kind of maybe what the Apostle Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 2 as the aroma of life or the aroma of death. The gospel is either something that's sweet to you and you go to it, or it sucks and you go away from it. And the parables, I wonder if they have that sort of divisive approach. Right. Sure, or Herod. Yeah. Yep, good. Right, so he describes the task of being a disciple of his, following him around, as being equivalent to being a fisher of persons. Yes, great. Okay, 1 Corinthians 13. And especially there in the context, all of the things that Paul says love is all the opposite of the things that the Corinthians were doing. So it turns out it's everywhere, isn't it? John 1, how's Jesus described? As the Logos. Why is that? Because the Logos in Greek philosophy functioned as a profound... And so notice that we've got different levels of contextualization even here. There's contextualization as illustration. That's a fairly surface kind of level. There's a contextualization as in contemporary events. That's maybe one level down. But then contextualization in terms of describing the whole person and work of Jesus Christ as the Logos, as the one, and the Logos became flesh. Oh, freak out. How can you have Logos and Sarkos together? Logos and flesh don't belong together. And so what John has done is he's taken this vision of the Logos as the sort of the rationality that lies behind all of reality, and he said that rationality has actually come to us and become flesh. And that's a very, very deep level of contextualization, isn't it? It's kind of getting into the entire worldview of a Greek kind of construction and then getting inside it. And I don't like violence metaphors usually, but it's a bit like in Star Wars, the best Star Wars, which was number 4. If you remember the original first one, how do you blow up a Death Star? The answer is you get a little bomb and you send it down a chute and it goes all the way right into the heart and blows it up. And that's what John is doing in John 1. There's this Death Star of Greek philosophy which separates off body from soul, right, in a terrible dualism. He plants a little seed in there by getting in there with the Logos. And then he says the Logos became Sarkos, the Logos became flesh, the Word became flesh. And he just blows up Greek philosophy right there.
So there are some philosophies that need to be blown up then?
I think pretty much every philosophy needs to be blown up. But you don't blow up philosophies by just saying, you're an idiot, right? You postmodernists, you're all idiots. It's not going to work. It's not intelligible. You see, you don't win anyone that way. No one gets it if you just yell at them. I mean, one problem, by the way, is that the only way we see people ever getting anything is in movies. Movies have a pretty much strictly 2-hour limit. And so what happens in movies is you have people shouting at each other, and then the response comes back, oh, thanks for pointing that out. I think I'll change my whole life right now. As if that ever happens. I mean, does anyone actually ever change by being shouted at? And yet in a movie, the way you have to move things along is these sort of totally unrealistic human interactions But we watch a lot of TV and we watch a lot of movies and we see all these completely unrealistic human interactions and we take them on board and think that yelling works. You should try it at home. Especially if you've got kids. See how that goes down.
In a public conversation between Tom Wright and the atheist historian Tom Holland described the Gospels and Paul's writings as a depth charge in the classical world.
Yes.
So very similar language.
Yeah, depth charge, which is a submarine destruction. I just started watching Das Boot. Has anyone seen that? Yeah. Okay, here's a definition of contextualization. Giving people the Bible's answers to the real questions people are asking in this time, in this place. Firstly, in language, and secondly, in forms that are comprehensible to them. That's the 1 Corinthians 14 intelligibility point. That are comprehensible to them, appealing to them with a force they feel and find compelling whether they agree or not. The result of good contextualization is that people say, it's a load of bollocks, but I wish it was true. I like what you're talking about is so sweet and makes so much sense that I'd like it to be true, even though I know it's not. Then you know you've done good contextualization because you've given them real answers, the Bible's answers, to the real questions that people are asking in this time and place. The real actual questions. You've done it in language and forms that are comprehensible to them by appealing to them with a force they feel and find compelling even if they don't agree with it. Notice, that's a quote from Keller, it's giving the Bible's answers. One of the charges that's made about contextualization is that it inevitably involves a dilution of or a departure from the gospel. And the answer to that is it can involve a departure from or a dilution of the gospel, but it doesn't need to. It relates to this second quote, which is from Don Carson. This is, I think, got a quadruple negative, which is impressive, but standard for Carson. He writes, while no truth which human beings may articulate can ever be articulated in a culture-transcending way. All right, let's just pause there. To put that positively, every truth human beings say, everything you say, has to be done in a way that's embedded in culture. Right? The reason for that is language itself just is one of the fundamental primary carriers of a culture. I believe in Icelandic there are 16 words for snow. 16 words. You know why that is? Because they've got different kind of snow up there. No, of course it's not because they've got different kind of snow up there. Snow's snow. What they do is that snow is such a significant part of life there that they have 16, they actually can see and perceive reality in such a way that they need 16 different words for snow. Whereas in Sydney, no one in Sydney's ever seen snow, other than when they come over to do ski tourism here in New Zealand. And so you know what there is? There's one word. Well, there's two. There's powder, which is good snow, and then there's other snow, which is just snow. You can't, anything you say is said in a language and therefore is bound up in a culture necessarily from the start. And so so Carson says, well, no truth which human beings may articulate can ever be articulated in a culture transcending way. There's no way to kind of extract truth out of culture and give it in a pure... It just doesn't exist, does it? Otherwise you're not saying it because you can't use language. There is no pure. So that's a kind of sobering thing. And actually we see that, that's why I say in the scriptures, we see that there are many, many different ways to, that the gospel itself is articulated. So the first half of what Carson says is no truth which human beings may articulate can ever be articulated in a culture transcending way. He matches that, he balances that, he holds that together in tension with this. That does not mean that the truth thus articulated does not transcend culture. Which means it's still possible for the truth that's articulated in a culture-embedded manner to be a truth which does, at the same time, speak to and inform and blow up and renew any given culture, all cultures. While no truth which human beings may articulate can ever be articulated in a culture-transcending way, we're stuck, we're just creatures, we don't get to create reality, we just have to live within it. That doesn't mean that the truth thus articulated does not transcend culture. And what that means is this. It simply is the case that when you articulate the gospel, whenever you try and speak the gospel, you'll be doing it in a culture-embedded manner. That is, you'll be doing it in a way that is fitted to a context. It can't not be. And most of us are so immersed, embedded in the context in which we have lived and grown and developed and been educated and family relations, we have not the faintest clue about just how context and culture laden our living of life is. That's why it's so good to travel. That's why it's so good to live other places, to see other contexts. You don't ask a fish about water. Because when you ask a fish about water, the fish says, "What's water?" It's just their whole life. And when it's their whole life, they can't sort of step back and have a look at it. What it means that you can't not contextualize. The only issue is whether you're doing good contextualization or not. Or, to put it in this way, to over-contextualize to a new generation means that you make an idol out of their culture. To under-contextualize to a new generation means you can make an idol out of the culture you come from. So when I started at the church where I serve, we were absolutely poised and ready for the 1950s to come around anytime soon. We had the traditional 7:30 service in the morning, because that's the obvious time for people to go to church. And then we had the more traditional 9:30 service. So the traditional 7:30 service depended upon a deep knowledge of the Anglican prayer book and hymn singing. And you could not understand the service if you didn't have that deep knowledge. And then the 9:30 service depended upon a deep knowledge of the Anglican prayer book and hymn singing, and also extra canticles, because we always sang the communion canticles as well. It was a perfectly contextualized service for the 1950s. It had made an idol out of the culture that they came from. And so the people there, they were lovely, septuagenarian, 70 and 80-year-old saints who just, when I talked to them about things, would say, "Why can't people just love the prayer book like I do?" And you know what? If Sydney loved the prayer book like they did, I don't think it would be such a terrible thing. It's a very fine thing, the prayer book. They should love it. Well, they might love it. It's just, no one did. Ashfield, particularly, where I'm based, in the sort of inner west of Sydney, had a massive Chinese migration into it. And the outreach strategy for St. John's Ashfield was learn the prayer book first so you can come to our church. And unsurprisingly, there was no one under 70. I was the youth group. Now, there are people in Ashfield who are prayer book people, and the only kind of service that they'll go to is a prayer book service. That's fine. So it's not that it's wrong to do. It's just that it's inadequate to do when the proportion of the population who has no idea about or interest in the prayer book is 98.9% of the population. And you've got to ask yourself the question, is it legitimate to have a primary mission field of 1.something% of the people in the area that we're responsible for missioning to? To the Jews, I became as a Jew. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. To the people of Ashford, I became actually like a 1950s Anglican. That's what I pretty much became. And you can't do it. You mustn't do it. So you can under-contextualize to a new generation that makes and if that means is that you've made an idol out of the culture you've come from. You can't not contextualize. Mind you, at the same time, you can over-contextualize to a new generation, which means you've made an idol out of their culture. And so, I did Katay church for a while, and sat around at coffee tables, as though, well, anyway, you know what I'm saying. It's just kind of as though that was a real effort at contextualization. It was faddish. It came and it went, and it was substitute contextualization, which was kind of making something of an idol out of a form rather than a substance, pretending that would do the job.
Shouldn't that play into it though?
It might.
Fads come and go, so why not play them?
And I think the reason is, and that's a really great question. Fads do come and go. Beards, for example. Next week. My wife has made it very clear to me. I think that the issue about fads is two things. One, remember how I said before, when we looked at the biblical examples of contextualization, that there are surface level contextualization, surface level issues, and then the deeper level issues. So that the logos issue was a deeper level issue than, say, the use of parables, for example. I'd suggest that fads almost always represent the surface level of a culture, and that it's the issues that are underneath that are the issues to which we need to contextualize rather than the fad. I think there's another part of it, which is that by definition, fads, as you say, come and go. And one of the interesting questions about that is what is the fad searching for, and why does it go? And the answer is because it's not finding what it's searching for. And so the issue to try and actually get a grip on is not so much the fad, but what is the fad searching for? And is there a way that the gospel and church life can be contextualized to reach and provide a gospel form of the thing that the fad is searching for, rather than getting caught up in the fad itself? You see what I'm saying there? And we'll come back to that, some of that more in a moment. So you see the point I'm making here is just to say contextualization is inevitable and necessary and biblically mandated. You can't not do it. The only question is whether you're doing it well or not. We're all terrible at it, can I just say? Well, at least in Sydney we are. Keller came to a conference in Sydney. It's the first and last time he will ever come to Australia or New Zealand. So I'm just telling you that. He's not going to come. Don't ask him. He keeps getting asked. I ask him. I'm the guy that's most likely to be able to get him, right? I'm part of his organisation. I've asked him at least 50 times, and the answer is no. He just hates travel, and he's not coming again. So the one and only time he came was to Sydney in 2014. And we had one of those corridor conversations. He has to leave in the last song of the session, otherwise he doesn't get any break, you see, because people just mob him and take selfies with him. I'm crying out loud. Anyway, see, there's an under-contextualised kind of life, isn't it? Get a selfie with, someone, get a selfie with Keller. So we go out in the corridor, and I escort him out, and we're talking there, and he says, you guys, you've got a whole lot of this ecosystem here. You've got the specialised ministries, and you've got church planting movements, you've got revitalisation movements, you've got a lot of this stuff. And I'm feeling pretty good at this point. I think, oh, yeah, it's true. And he says, you should be doing much better than you are. It's hopeless. So I was having a good day, and instead of being defensive, I was curious. By the way, that's a really pretty good mark of whether you're having a good day or not, whether you're having a gospel renewal day or not. If you're defensive, the gospel is not operating strongly in your life. If you're curious, the gospel is operating nicely in your life. Okay? Anytime you're defensive, you just go, actually, I'm the problem here. Even if the other person's a problem too, you're the problem here. So I was having a good day, and I wasn't defensive, and I said, why do you think that is that we're not doing better? And he said, well, there's two reasons. One, you all fight like cats and dogs, and two, you wouldn't know how to contextualise to save your lives. and he was right on both counts. So I'm finding for myself this is a huge learning journey, a huge learning journey. One of the ways to do it, as I said, was to learn from other places. And I want to just take some examples from the early church.
Can I, before you move on,
Sure.
real quick. So after his comments, 2014, what have you done differently to contextualise?
Uh,
And what have you seen from that?
all of which will come next and the next session this afternoon, as I'll try and give you where I personally and we in the City context, or the City network have gotten to on it. What I do want to say is that I said this last week to a group of church planners, understanding that something is there to be done is a very different thing from doing it. I wish that merely understanding something meant I did it. Like, love my wife as Christ loved the church. I can give you an A-grade exegesis of that passage. But it's best if you don't ask my wife. Because understanding something and doing it are two quite different things. And I can talk about how I understand the need for and even what contextualization demands. Doing it is a whole different question. So it's still very much a journey for me. I'm hoping that by the time I'm of advanced years as Gunnar, that I will have gotten somewhere with it. I'm many months behind Gunnar. So remember what Keller said, church planting and renewal movements with specialised ministries and a contextualised theological vision. Let me talk to you a little bit about the early church, and particularly through a book by a guy called Larry Hurtado called Destroyer of the Gods. Really interesting book about the early Christian movements. He asks the question, how is it that from 10,000 people in 100 AD to 200,000 people by 200 AD and 6 million people by 300 AD, which was 15% of the population, how could the church grow like that? One of the most astonishing, rapid, sustained periods of growth in any kind of movement or religion or philosophy or any ever in the history of the world, matched only by China in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. You know China right now, 150 maybe million Christians in China, upward of 10% of the population. Do you know how much more Christian China is than New Zealand? And it leaves Australia for dead. China. So there's an astonishing thing that's happening in China. When did it all happen? When they kicked the missionaries out. What have they just done recently? They're starting to kick the missionaries out again. So you keep praying for China because this is China's century. And if I've heard a Christian leader in China say, what's really interesting just right now at the moment in China is that Confucianism has failed, communism has failed. The soul of China is empty right now. And some people are trying to fill it with consumerism and capitalism. And the Christians are trying to fill it with Jesus Christ. And can you imagine if the soul of China gets filled with Jesus Christ and what that does for our world going forward? Well, Hurtado says, what happened in the early church to mean that it grew in this remarkable, sustained, massive growth to 15% of the population was two things. They had a radically progressive social ethic and they had a radically conservative personal ethic. And they had both of them together. A radically progressive social ethic, which meant they took care of the poor, not just their own. You may know that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries there were fierce plagues and outbreaks of disease which decimated populations. And one of the really interesting things was the way that Christians took care of sick people. There's two remarkable quotes I want to just mention to you. One is there's a complaint by an emperor saying, how come these blasted Christians care so much better for our pagan people than our pagan people do? Because the pagans, as soon as plague would enter the town, would all flee to the hills. The only people who would stay and look after the sick and bury the dead were the Christians. And then there's this other just fantastic quote which talks about how when the Christians would do that, when they would stay in the town and sometimes they would substitute themselves. They would die while caring for others who lived. And there's just this sort of beautiful conclusion of the quote, which is, where do you think they learned to substitute themselves from? They'd contextualized the gospel, you see. It's the gospel of substitutionary atonement that they'd contextualized into substituting for their pagan neighbours. Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist, wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity, just sort of lays this all out and says that it was particularly this radical social ethic never seen before in the history of certainly Rome, that had a care for all people, especially because the intensity of the tribalism of family first and then city, which meant that no one else mattered other than you and yours, except to Christians. There was no slave or free or Jew or Greek or rich or poor or male or female. Everyone was made in the image of God, a radically progressive social ethic, and particularly non-retaliation. These stories of the martyrs who did not retaliate in public moments of their own execution, who didn't seek revenge or vengeance, Christians who didn't retaliate, constituted an astonishing witness. You know what the word martyr means, of course. It means witness. That the very act of dying for Jesus in the way that they did was a witness to the Jesus for whom they died. So on the one hand, a radically progressive social ethic, and at the same time, what you might call a radically conservative personal ethic. One of the social practices at the time was what was conveniently and euphemistically named exposure, which meant that if you had a child, a baby that you didn't want, having a child was all sorts of pain because you had to feed another mouth and so on, and particularly girls. And you see this is also part of what's happened in the history of China, right? Under the one-child policy, what happened was unborn children were aborted, including at birth, as the head breached. There would often enough be these, you know how what's that thing called? There would be an injection in through the fontanelle in order to kill the child before it actually emerged. So that there's now an imbalance of 20-something men to women, massively in favour of men, or at least maybe that's massively in favour of women. There's a lot more men than women, is all I'm saying. And it was the same in the ancient times. Families would expose their babies, which means they'd take them out to a rubbish tip and just drop the baby there. And so what did the Christians do? They went and collected them. Now, for me to have an extra child is like more sleepless nights, but that's the biggest hassle, really, sleeplessness. In that context where everyone was just maybe 1 millimetre above starvation, to have an extra mouth to feed put everyone underneath, right? Seriously difficult. But the Christians had this radically conservative personal ethic, which was opposing of abortion and infant exposure. They just collected abandoned babies. And they had a sexual exclusiveness based on a covenantal rather than a gratification view of sex. So in Roman society, you had prostitutes, you had concubines, and you had wives. When I say you, I mean, of course, men. Women were the prostitutes, the concubines, and the wives. But the men would have a wife for reproduction and the family name, a concubine for pleasure, and prostitutes for when it was convenient. So it was a gratification view of sex. And the Christians had a sexual exclusiveness based rather on a covenantal view of sex, which said sex was for a covenant relationship, a covenanted relationship. It was such a powerful intimacy between two people that the only thing that made it proper was an equal emotional, financial, social intimacy. That meant sex and all of that other covenant commitment went together. So really interestingly, a radically progressive and a radically social ethic and a radically conservative personal ethic, which then broke down the tribal and religious identities that were the fundamental units of society in that time, and so created a radically inclusive and transformative community. And you see that reflected in the phrase that's repeated by the Apostle Paul again and again: no longer Jew or Greek, or circumcised or uncircumcised, or barbarian or Scythian, or slave or free. That is, these are just words to us, right? Jew or Greek, just sort of. But these were not words in the context. In the context, these are fundamental. This is, I was saying to Nigel on the way in, what New Zealand has done with Indigenous relationships, which I know almost nothing about, although I mean a tiny, tiny bit, from an Australian perspective, is genius and heroic, right? We are a disgrace, and just look at New Zealand with jealousy, really, with what you've managed to do. Now, you no doubt may have a different story here, right? And I'm saying I don't know anything. All I'm saying is from afar, it's light years ahead of what we've done in our country, in Australia. But these issues are serious issues, aren't they? And that's what the gospel did in the early church. And that's how the church went from nothing, from 12 or 120 or whatever it was, to 15% of the population in an astonishingly small amount of time, historically speaking. A radically progressive social ethic, a radically conservative personal ethic, and a radically inclusive and transformative community. So, let's take that a little bit and ask the question, what might a contextualised theological vision then have been? Now, I just want to draw on some other work here by a guy called Colin Gunton. He's a really terrific British theologian. He died before he could write his major piece the way that theologians do. A great shame. He wrote a book nonetheless called The One, the Three and the Many. This is a heavy theology book, which is just to warn you not to say don't read it. He makes a comment that the great intellectual challenge of the age for the Roman Empire was the dilemma of choosing between what he calls Heraclitan flux and Parmenidean unity. As you know, right? What that means is this: the two poles of the sort of philosophy which permeated through into society, right, was on the one hand that everything's different, nothing's the same, everything changes, all there is flux and change, and there's no solid substance in life. There's just everything comes and goes, and there's nothing real and lasting and true. Heraclitus was a philosopher. He had a saying, you never step into the same river twice. Why do you never step into the same river twice? Because it moves. It's always different. And if it's always different, what have you got that you can base your life on solidly and substantially and that's reliable? And the answer is nothing, says Heraclitus, so just do whatever the hell you want. Right? Which makes some sense if that's what you think. It's kind of postmodern. That's right. Parmenides said on the contrary that all of that flux was just an appearance, and that everything was the same and was all underneath the surface changes were was an unchanging reality, and that was all there was to it. And you see that what does unchanging reality that's underneath every difference lead to? It leads to actually dictatorship. It leads to a complete refusal to allow for diversity and difference. And these were genuine issues at the time. Now, as I say, we don't have anything, we don't know this stuff. This is a completely different world to ours. But what Gunton says is that what emerged was a 3rd century contextualized theological vision. I mean, he doesn't use that language, but this is the point he makes, which was the truth of the gospel of the triune God, who was 3 in 1. You see, distinction in unity, many and one at the same time. And one of the things Gunton says is that won the intellectual battle of the day. That was what was at stake. It was the fundamental intellectual, cultural battle of the day. And what won it was the doctrine of the Trinity deployed into its context. So it It was both this church planting and renewal movements and specialized ministries with this radically progressive social ethic and a radically conservative personal ethic, alongside a contextualized theological vision, the doctrine of the Trinity for its day, which meant that the church grew. So what's our job? Well, what we need is a transformed community which interacts with the key distinctive markers and lifestyle, particularly around money, sex and power. I'd suggest that a critical issue in our context is overcoming the left-right divide. Let me put this in a pointy way. If you unambiguously identify with one political side or the other, it's because you've under-contextualized some things and you've over-contextualized other things. In Australia, as you know, as I said before, we're having a federal election this Saturday. And the complete incompetence of just about every Christian contribution to the debate, the inability to transcend the left and right stuff, which is how, in a two-party democracy, it all works out as, has been just kind of tragic. And I've said nothing. When even an idiot can look wise, says the Proverbs. When you don't have anything to say, you just shut up, because it's crucial for us to overcome the left-right divide, partly to break down 21st century tribalisms. So I would suggest that one of the key markers of a distinctive lifestyle here, which captures this radically progressive social ethic and a radically conservative personal ethic into radically inclusive communities, would need to deal with these issues. And at the same time, a contemporary contextualized theological vision. Sam Chan is a Sydney-based evangelist and author. He's just written a book called Evangelism in a Skeptical World. And he introduces the book like this. He says, last night, while my wife and I were watching TV, a UFO landed in our backyard. A green alien got out of the UFO and asked us to join him, so my wife and I got into his UFO and he took us to his home planet, Jupiter. There, he showed us around his home city. We had dinner with his family. Afterward, we got into the UFO and returned to Earth, but when we got back, because of the space-time continuum, we went through a time portal and only 1 second of Earth time had passed. And he says that often the way we talk about the gospel is as both comprehensible and as persuasive as that. And that's pretty challenging, isn't it? Because you know that if you tried, I mean, we laugh at it because it's it's because it's so ludicrous. And yet, and what Chan is saying is that as he talks to unbelievers, that they find the Christian gospel as ludicrous as this. And that's because we can so under-contextualize that we say the Christian gospel with total truthfulness and faithfulness in a way that's nearly totally counterproductive. In order to do contextualization well, you've got to understand the context, the narrative especially, because the way that the context is brought to us is by stories. The Gospel's a story. Did you notice that in 5 chapters, actually? The context is brought to us by stories. And so what are the narratives of our age? In the first 3 centuries, it was Greek philosophy and the inability, this dilemma, this problem, this unresolved problem that they had between the many and the one, the flux and the unity. And we won that debate. We solved that supracultural problem for their time. We did it. We won it. Heroic effort by a massive brain theologians. Huge contribution. The Cappadocian does not. It's not a coffee. They were from a city called Cappadocia, the Cappadocian theologians. Charles Taylor, I think, is probably one of the best and most insightful authors on the narratives of our age and what the culture, particularly in Western and Western-influenced circles or contexts, is. Charles Taylor wrote a massive 800-page book called A Secular Age, virtually incomprehensible. So incomprehensible that a guy called James K.A. Smith wrote a book to explain Taylor's book. So his whole 200-page book is a book explaining Taylor's big fat book. Smith's book is called How, brackets, Not to Be Secular. It's, I think, a 7.5 out of 10 go at doing that. Keller wrote a book called Preaching, and his chapter 5, 20 pages, is, I think, and this is what Keller, I don't know how he does it, he understands what people are saying better than they understand it themselves. That's what he does. Well, it's one of the things he does. He understands better what other people are saying than they understand it themselves. And so he's got this chapter 5 of a book on preaching called Preaching to the Culture, which summarizes and compresses Taylor's 800-page book. Now, obviously, it leaves out a thing or two, but in, I think, an exceptionally helpful way. Keller says, summarizing Taylor, that the issues in our age are based around what he calls cultural sub-narratives. The identity narrative, the morality narrative, the community or society narrative, and the truth or the history narrative. That these are what philosopher Michael Foucault called unthoughts. That is, you don't think them, you just think from them. You don't have to defend them. Everyone knows why Israel Folau, has done the wrong thing. No one really is trying to justify it because everyone just argues from why they know it's wrong about what he said. We all just know. The identity narrative, that I am my inner being. I'm not my role anymore. In the 1950s, starting work at the bank and working your way up from a teller up to being a manager and then running a branch and then being at head office and then retiring with a gold watch, that made sense of life. Everyone got that. Or being a housewife who married at 20 and had kid number 1 at 21 and kid number 2 and staying at home, and that made sense then. Well, sort of. But we're not defined by our roles anymore. We're defined by our inner reality, and in particular, our desires. And what that means is that what's right and what's wrong follows very simply. What's right is that you live out your desires, but you have to live it out in such a way that you don't interfere with someone else's desires. It's just as simple as that. The only thing that makes right and wrong is that you aren't being inauthentic to yourself on the one hand, and that you aren't being interfering to others on the other hand. Don't get in other people's faces. Let them be what they want to be. If they want to dye their hair pink, to pick a really non-controversial and trivial example, let them dye their hair pink. If they want to be gay, let them be gay. If they want to be, and off it goes. That's what morality is. Which of course leads to a kind of community vision or anti-vision, which is community constitutes not interfering with other people. And so you see how this kind of narrative with its various sub-narratives is sort of running out of steam at this point, isn't it? Really? That's as good as community gets? And the truth or history narrative, which is this is the right side of history. This is where history's been going, that we're freeing ourselves, that the past is bad with its authority and its roles and its restrictions and its constraints and its traditions, and that as we free ourselves more and more and more from all of these things into a place of freedom, then you're on the right side of history. That's where history's going, and anyone who stops that is to be opposed and shut down. I read in the paper yesterday, the UN guys here for the 2-month anniversary of Christchurch and the killings in Christchurch, terrible thing. And he's saying we have to eradicate hate speech. Such an interesting thing to say, isn't it, for a UN person? And he's appointed someone who's in charge of preventing genocide. The same person, their job now is to eradicate across the world hate speech. Now you think about what's involved in that thought. What is the story that lies behind making that a sensible thing for a person of significant stature in the UN to say? If you went back, you don't have to go back very far, where the idea of eradicating anyone's speech was the thing that we fought wars for, against, to not do that. And unless you understand the narrative of our time, unless you've lived in it, unless you've talked to enough people who just live it out, unless you're just in connection and relationship with it, you've read their books and you've been to their plays and it's all a bit distasteful because it's not your world, right? You just won't be able to contextualize the gospel. One of the things Keller does, and I think this is an absolutely brilliant move, is that he shows for the Western context that each of these issues actually comes out of the gospel. Who taught us that the true you is the inner you, not your role, not the outer you? Who taught us that? Who gave us that? It was Jesus, wasn't it? Who said that it's not what goes into a person that defiles them, it's what comes out of them from their heart. And so Keller says Western postmodern culture is just Christian informed, having cut itself off from its moorings, but it's still informed. And so that means that there's a kind of a strategy that we can adopt as we engage with this process of contextualization. Notice the cultural primacy of desire right now. I think from when you asked what have we done in Sydney since then, what I've tried to do is draw the link between, on the one hand, the cultural primacy of desire. It's all about what your desires are, what your inward feelings are, being authentic to yourself. That's the narrative. That's what determines what right and wrong is. That's how community is formed. It's tribes of parallel desire. At the same time, in Scripture, your heart is the essence of being a human being. And what is it that hearts do? What hearts do is that they desire. Romans 1:24 says that. The desires of the heart. And so my own theory that I'm trying to work on and understand and unpack and preach and live and evangelize with is that there's a point of connection, of profound connection, which is to do with the deep story of our age around this issue of desire, which comes into direct contact with the biblical story about what a human being is in terms of the heart. And that if we can find the point of connection between those two things, then we might in our time be able to do what those early Christians did in their time in relation to their culture. And if we can manage that, then what we will have done is to have created a contextualized theological vision. And if we can match that with a transformed community with a radically progressive social ethic and a radically conservative personal ethic, so that we're a radically inclusive community, then we might see God do amongst us the same kind of thing that he's doing amongst the Chinese right now. Right? It's not like he's not into it anymore. And it's not like it can't happen in somewhere like New York. So there's no reason it can't happen in New Zealand either. And there's no reason it can't happen in Australia. But there's a lot of work in this. And it's not just preach the gospel. What's the problem with the phrase just preach the gospel? The word just. There's no just. There's no just. We're called to do profound hard work because the only way we're going to reach a city is by really, really insightfully, artfully contextualizing. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually looks like and what the content of that is this afternoon after lunch. At which we go to right now.